Is there a particular Facebook link or streaming? It's
link on the Mexico Institute Facebook page.
Got it.
Oh. Ricardo looks so serious, tan serio, amor.
Estoy preparándome para tratar de tener una buena interpretación.
I thought I should just say quickly that the order will be David, Gemma, Edna, and Ricardo.
Perfect. And Gemma, so you know, your chapter will be coming out later on today.
Awesome, fantastic. I'm so happy about that. I was wondering, actually. Cool. Great, thank you. I'll share it.
Okay, it looks like we're live. I'm getting a message from Tony Wayne so they can see us and hear us. Thank you, Tony, for reaching out to us and letting us know this. My name is Duncan Wood. I am the Vice President for Strategy and New Initiatives at the Wilson Center, but in a former life, which ended quite recently, I was the director of the Mexico Institute for 8 years. It was the greatest pleasure of my life, I have to say, to run the Mexico Institute. But the Mexico Institute has recently had an upgrade, and I am delighted to announce the arrival of my new colleague, but friend of a long, long time, Andrew Rudman, the new director of the Mexico Institute, who I have no doubt is going to do an absolutely sterling job running the Mexico Institute. And one of his first jobs is to actually introduce and to host this annual Security and Rule of Law Forum today. So Andrew, let me just say in front of our public that I am delighted to have you as my colleague. I'm delighted that we're going to be able to work together. And, you know, I want to wish you the very best of luck with the Mexico Institute over the coming years. You've got a great group of people, some of whom are here on this call today, who are there to support you. And of course, you will always have the support of the Wilson Center itself. So, so over to you, my friend. Good luck and Godspeed.
Well, thank you, Duncan. Thank you very much for the kind words and all the support. And I am indeed really excited to be here, both today with all of you and more generally at the Mexico Institute. This is such an important moment in U.S.-Mexico relations and for Mexico generally. And I'm really looking forward to working with all of you, some of whom I've known, as Duncan mentioned, for a long time, and others that I have not yet met, but look forward to meeting today and going forward. As Duncan mentioned, my job is really just to do a quick introduction and hand this over. I think that this is the 9th annual U.S.-Mexico Security Forum, and I suspect that in the 8 previous occasions, whoever had the role I have now said, oh, this is a pivotal moment in U.S.-Mexico security relations. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that today, yet again, is a pivotal moment on that issue. And we'll have, I hope, a great conversation. We have 2 panels today and then 2 more a week from today. My job, as I mentioned, as Duncan mentioned, is just to introduce the moderators and then maybe help keep time if we go over, because we do have a fairly tight schedule this morning. Let me also note that translation is available by clicking on the little globe icon at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to take advantage of that this morning. So in the interest of time, I'm going to do a quick introduction of the first panel's moderator, Eric Olsen, and with apologies because I'm truncating what is a much more impressive bio. Many of you know Eric. He's currently a member of the Seattle International Foundation Interim Leadership Team and their Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives. His primary responsibility is to oversee the Foundation's engagement with the DC-based policy community. He also provides strategic policy advice to the Foundation's Central American partners on priority issues such as promoting rule of law and good governance, ending forced migration and displacement, ensuring equity, and strengthening civil society. He also oversees SIF's Anti-Impunity Project and Independent Journalism Fund. In addition, as if that isn't enough, Eric is also a Wilson Center Global Fellow and served at the Mexico Institute and the Latin America Program as Deputy Director for 11 years. Previously, Eric has worked for the Secretariat of Political Affairs at the OAS, at Amnesty International USA, and the Washington Office on Latin America, as well as for Augsburg's Colleges Center for Global Education in Mexico, and in Honduras as an economic development specialist. Eric has published numerous articles and books, including Crime and Violence in the Northern Triangle, How US Policy is Helping, Hurting, and Can Be Improved. So with that, Eric, I'll turn it over to you for the first panel.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I just want to say a word of congratulations to you and welcome. I know you're familiar with the Mexico Institute and Wilson Center, but it's great to have you on board. You have enormous shoes to fill. Andrew Seeley, of course, and Duncan Wood most recently. But as Duncan mentioned, you're surrounded by a top-notch team and top-notch friends and allies and colleagues that we've been working with for many years. And so we wish you all the best and much success in this new stage for you and for the Mexico Institute. You mentioned that, every year, and when I first started organizing this conference with Duncan's help and support in 2012, every year there were some common themes and topics, and incredibly important moment in U.S.-Mexico relations that it didn't fail, that every year we were talking about that. But sadly, unfortunately, the other topic that we always addressed in this context was this parent enormous and stubborn problem of homicides and violence in Mexico. I wish we would have solved it in these 9 years, but obviously we haven't. And it's gone up, it's gone down, it seems to be up, maybe going back down again, we don't know, but it's a stubborn and persistent problem. And so I'm glad that we have some of the top minds, some of the top analysts to help us tackle this issue once again. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers briefly, and then we'll give them each about 7-8 minutes, and I'll throw a message into the chat to let you know when you have 2 minutes left, if that's okay. We're going to start with David Shirk. Dr. David Shirk is a professor and graduate director of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of San Diego and a global fellow at the Mexico Institute with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. David has been a longtime friend and partner. We've worked together on numerous book projects, including Shared Responsibility, which he helped lead with me back in 2011. And he's also known for enormous work analysis into the problem of homicides and drug violence in Mexico. He's written several volumes entitled either Drug Violence in Mexico up to 2017, and more recently, looking at organized crime and violence. And he will present today the latest information about the data on drug violence. His talk is entitled Ongoing Criminal Violence Amid the COVID-19 Pandemic. Secondly, we're going to hear from Dr. Gema Clope Santamaria, also a good friend of the Wilson Center, has worked on numerous projects with us. She is currently the Assistant Professor of Latin America History at Loyola University in Chicago. Prior to joining Loyola, she was Assistant Professor of International Relations at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, known as ITAM, and was also a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Gema will help us delve into some of the issues around violence, the nature of violence, the kinds of violence Mexicans are experiencing, looking beyond simply the data, but understanding the phenomenon more fully. She has written extensively on this topic, most recently in her latest book entitled Violencia y Crimen en América Latina, Representaciones, Poder y Política, which is now publicly available. Next, we'll hear from good friend Edna Jaime Treviño, who's had over 25 years of applied investigation, research, and experience in public policy, and more than 10 years of experience directing think tanks in Mexico. Currently, she's the director of Mexico Evalúa, one of the more outstanding think tanks in Mexico that we at the Wilson Center have been happy to partner with on numerous occasions. Throughout her career, Edna Jaime has advocated for the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption System and served as the coordinator of the Citizen Participation Selection Committee. And she has a regular column in the newspaper in Mexico. So welcome, Edna. Edna will help look at the current government's two top priorities for dealing with organized crime and violence, one being the creation of the National Guard, and the second one, the prioritizing of social programs, the approach that Andrés Manuel López Obrador has called abrazos, no balazos, hugs, not bullets. What are some of those social programs and how are they working? Finally, last but not least, we'll hear from Ricardo Márquez Blas. He has more than 28 years of experience in design, development, implementation, and evaluation of public security, crime prevention, and information system strategies and policies. He previously served as the head of Public Security Information Unit at the Mexico National Security Commission, the CNS, and for 4 years, he was the chief of Plataforma Mexico, an ecosystem of databases, technological tools, and information systems for public security and crime prevention in Mexico. Ricardo will be talking about social programs and organized crime in Mexico and looking at how these are working and their effectiveness. And he will also touch on the issue of US-Mexico security relations. So we have a very broad, deep set of panelists. Welcome all. You have about 7-8 minutes, and I'm going to turn first to David Shirk. Thank you.
You told me I was going to have like 15-20 minutes. Eric.
No.
Okay.
No,
all right.
no.
Sorry. Anyway.
Nice try, Eric.
All right. I'm going to try to squeeze these 40 slides into the 6 or 7 minutes that Eric gave us. First of all, thank you, Duncan, Andrew, Eric. This is unfortunately an annual institution in or at least an annual ritual to revisit the security situation in Mexico. And each year it seems as though the picture doesn't look any brighter, or there's no light at the end of the tunnel, whatever metaphor you want to use. But what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the key security trends that we've seen in recent years and over the last year especially, to set up the discussion a little bit, as Eric mentioned. First of all, as Eric mentioned and others have mentioned, I mean, the most important ongoing challenge on the security front in Mexico is the fact that there is a continued elevated level of violence that we've seen over the last year. This figure shows the number of intentional homicides, homicide cases, and homicide victims reported by the national security system, national public security system in Mexico. It's a little bit confusing because there is this distinction between homicide cases and homicide victims. The darker line here at the top shows you the victim count, which has only been, surprisingly, only been counted for the last 5 years or so. we can see that Mexico experienced this long gradual decline in the number of homicides from the mid-1990s until the late 2000s, to the mid-2000s. And then we saw violence move sharply upward until about 2012. From 2012 to 2015, the period I like to refer to as the Pax Sinaloa, we saw a decline in violence, during which we almost went back to pre-Calderon levels. Since 2018, of course, homicides have risen to a very high level and have sustained that even during the pandemic. As you can see, the number of homicides today in Mexico remains well above the highest levels seen during the drug cartel war of the late 2010s. Another characteristic of this violence that has been frequently commented on is the uneven geographic distribution and the geographic concentration of violence in certain corridors, in certain zones, which are not coincidentally associated with particular organized crime group strongholds or plazas or whatever you want to call them. This year, we have seen an uptick in violence in some other areas, particularly in Tabasco and in somewhat in Mexico City. But for the most part, the geographic picture here looks very similar to what we've seen in the past. A couple of comments about the current administration. It's important to note that López Obrador started his term with the highest levels of violence, at least as measured by homicide, of any Mexican president in recent memory. And so the challenge that he faced from the outset was very high. We've seen some motion here, which I'll talk a little bit about. In particular, you can see this downward trend over the course of the past year. We've seen a fairly, from January to December, we've actually seen a pretty substantial decrease in the number of homicides each month, by hundreds of lives saved, so to speak. And some of that, of course, is very likely due to reduced activity from COVID-19, but a lot of it may have to do with the increasing consolidation of power by the new generation cartel, which appears to be gaining the upper hand in Mexico's criminal, violent criminal conflicts. If you look at the number of, this next slide is mislabeled. This is the number of femicides, which has become an issue of greater concern in the last, sorry, I can't stand that. There we go. If you look at the number of femicides in the last few years, which only began to be reported in 2015 with the changing of SNSP's methodology, we've seen that number consistently going up, but that's probably a result of better reporting and prosecution of femicides than an actual dramatic increase in women being specifically targeted. Of course, women are more targeted when there is more violence, but the steady increase suggests that this is partly a measurement increase. We've also seen increases in recent years in kidnappings and especially extortion. One of the things I find really fascinating is that in periods of high violence, extortion tends to increase much more dramatically than kidnapping. The correlation between kidnapping and homicides is about 0.36 with a high level of statistical significance, but the correlation between extortion and homicide is like 0.5. It's a fairly strong correlation. So there's, I think, interesting insights that can be gained by looking at the way different forms of criminal activity are correlated. You can see that kidnapping is a little bit more evenly distributed throughout the country compared to violence. It's actually not necessarily, as I said, as strongly associated with homicide as some of the other as some other categories like extortion, which tends to map fairly closely to what we've seen in terms of homicide. In terms of a couple just quick final reflections on 2020, I think this is the same slide I use every year, but I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that breaking down criminal organizations, targeting kingpins has not been a particularly successful strategy, both because it tends to foment more violence between criminal organizations and within criminal organizations as they fragment and as they encroach on each other's territories. And because ultimately, when you get rid of one kingpin, you typically get another one. And it just goes on and on. The second insight, I think, is just that COVID-19 has not dramatically reduced the levels of criminal activity or criminal violence. And in fact, the couple of hundred lives that we've saved each month are obviously lost by the hundreds more that we lose each month because of COVID-19. The latest estimates officially say 150,000 COVID-19 deaths in Mexico. It's probably close to double that, right? Mexico saw an increase in unexpected deaths in 2020 of around 275,000. Right, so the gap between what we anticipated and what we gained in terms of deaths from COVID is pretty substantial. The last comment, Eric, is just the problem of accountability. Well, first, the problem of institutional capacity and whether or not Mexico has the capability it needs to take on criminal activity, to prosecute these thousands of homicides and bring people to justice. Whether it has the institutional integrity, that is whether the problem of corruption is so severe that it fundamentally hampers any kind of rule of law efforts in Mexico. And then the problem of political will, which Edna is obviously going to talk about. But if we're not going to seriously confront violent criminal behavior with serious consequences, if we're just going to adopt a strategy of nicely, politely asking drug traffickers to stop killing each other and killing other people, are we going to have an effective security strategy for Mexico in the foreseeable future? And unfortunately, it does not. I hate to end on a pessimistic note, but I don't see a near-term dramatic improvement of the security situation in Mexico, and I'm starting to lose hope for the long term under the current circumstances. So I'll end on that cheery note, and thank you all for this. Our reports and some of our data are available on justiceinmexico.org. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David. Always uplifting to hear from you. Next, we'll turn to Dr. Gema Lopez Santa Maria, Assistant Professor of Latin American History at Loyola University in Chicago. Adelante, Gema. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here and join this conversation today. Special thanks to Duncan Wood for the invitation and to Eric Olsen for moderating this session. So I would like to focus my presentation on some of the main trends that characterize violence today in Mexico, and then reflect on some of the policy implications that derive from this characterization. Many of these trends are not new, but show instead persistent and concerning continuities in relation to the violence observed under previous administrations. These continuities, I would argue, reveal the persistent failure to address the social and institutional roots of violence in Mexico, as well as the need to produce a better understanding of the many forms of violence that, beyond drugs and organized crime, impact citizen security. So there are 4 characteristics I would like to underline of violence. First, the violence the country experiences today is, as that of the previous years, lethal and spectacular. In the years 2018 and 2019, the number of people murdered in the country reached record levels. Although last year, the total of homicides was slightly lower, homicide rates remain high. While not all of these killings follow the same pattern in terms of levels of visibility, those that receive most attention share important characteristics. They are overt, public, and involve high levels of cruelty, including beheadings, maiming, burnings, and hangings, which suggests perpetrators do not only intend to get rid of the victims, but also to send a message to the government, to the general public, and to opposing criminal factions. The spectacular character of these forms of violence matters. It impacts people's perceptions of security. It can contribute shaping citizen support for short-term and punitive as opposed to integral responses to security. And it denotes authorities' incapacity to deter these groups' use of overt violence by using focused and selective forms of deterrence. While many of these spectacular killings have been attributed to the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the origin of many, if not most, of these killings remains unknown, including the killings behind the thousands of people found on mass graves across Mexico. This takes me to the second point. Although most media and public attention continues to be on the drug business, violence has for a long time now been linked to criminal activities that go beyond the drug trade, including human trafficking, fuel theft, kidnappings, and extortions of small and large businesses. Many analysts and decision makers have acknowledged this shift, hence the use of the term organized criminal organizations instead of drug trafficking organizations. However, I would say that security responses and US-Mexico cooperation efforts continue for the most part to frame these issues under a war on drugs framework, thus precluding a better understanding of the several actors participated in the production of violence. Third, the violence perpetrated by several of these criminal organizations presents an apparent contradiction. On the one hand, it has become increasingly selective, targeting specific groups and categories of people, including journalists, public officials, priests, as well as environmental and human rights activists. At the same time, violence seems more generalized, random, and capable of impacting more people on the ground. Some of the most visible killings taking place over the last 2 years, including the massacre of 9 members of the Levarón family in northern Mexico, have involved civilians or people on the sidelines of the so-called war on drugs. For years, Mexican officials, but so too public opinion, have tended to present violence as selective and as impacting only those that are involved in something. The more stories that surface about common people, being students, workers, or even children, falling victim to brutal killings, the more this sense of reassurance that violence happens to others, however fabricated or groundless, the more it will fade away with clear consequences for citizens' sense of security. Fourth, the fourth characteristic is that violence impacting Mexico today goes beyond that produced by organized criminal organizations, and there is an urgent need to understand it better. These include armed robberies, lynchings, killings perpetrated by vigilante groups gone rogue, state-led killings, and femicides, several of which, including the brutal murder of Ingrid Escamilla in February of 2020, originate in domestic violence. More so, evidence suggests that even in localities that have an important presence of organized crime, including Acapulco, Tijuana, even Apatzingán, people's security is mainly affected by other crimes, including robberies and domestic violence. Moreover, people report feeling insecure due to other threats to their well-being, including access to public infrastructure, housing, and employment. Now, given these 4 characteristics of violence, let me just conclude by pointing at 3 policy recommendations that derive from this characterization. First, we need to move the conversation beyond an approach focused on drug cartels and acknowledge that many of the other expressions of violence that do not originate in the drug business and that are part of an ecology of disorganized violence, of which we know very little about. Extortions, kidnappings, femicides are only some of the expressions of violence that escape the narrative of battles amongst cartels that tend to occupy most public debates on violence in Mexico and the United States. Second, there is an urgent need to strengthen the investigative capacity of police and prosecutors. Although headlines every day refer to the actions of some of the most vicious criminal organizations, the truth is that we do not know who is behind the vast majority of the killings, including the ones that have led to the dozens of bodies found in mass graves. In order to tackle criminal violence effectively, Mexican authorities need to improve their capacity to investigate and to overcome the many deficiencies of the justice system. Third and last, The lethal, spectacular, and seemingly generalized character of violence will likely increase public support for militarized and short-term security responses. The Mexican government, however, should avoid easy shortcuts. Policy responses that fail to address the social and institutional roots of violence have been costly and largely ineffective. They have produced a vicious cycle of violence, wherein a permanent sense of crisis leads to short-term solutions that yield limited, if not negative, consequences. Similarly, cooperation with the United States should focus on integral, evidence-based, and strategically targeted prevention efforts. The pandemic and its economic impact will only deepen the social vulnerability that contributes to fuel violence in Mexico, from domestic violence to armed robberies and even support for vigilante justice. Hence, security cooperation should aim at addressing the structural and institutional determinants of violence. This is not time for silver bullet or short-term solutions. Thank you. I think you're muted.
Thank you, Gemma. Really appreciate it. We'll turn now to Edna Jaime Treviño, the director of Mexico Evalúa in Mexico City. Thank you. Adelante, Edna.
Thank you very much, Eric. And I'm really grateful for giving me the opportunity to speak in Spanish. I am better in my native language. So, muchas gracias a todas y todos. Espero que ustedes y sus seres queridos estén sanos y bien. Agradezco a mi querido Duncan Wood, como siempre, por su amable invitación para participar en este panel de seguridad, ya en su 9ª edición. Y te felicito, Duncan, por tu nuevo nombramiento como vicepresidente de Estrategia y Nuevas Iniciativas del Wilson Center. Andrew, estoy segura que tendremos esquemas de colaboración muy fructíferos. Muy bienvenido y te deseo el mayor éxito posible. Y bueno, saludo con aprecio a mis colegas del panel y por supuesto a Eric Olsen, pues que ha hecho una excelente labor de moderación esta mañana. Quiero compartir con ustedes algunas reflexiones sobre la difícil situación de violencia que vive México. Para darnos una idea rápida de dónde venimos, pensemos en términos muy simples, en lo que ha pasado en los meses de enero de los últimos 3 años. En enero de 2018, en plena precampaña electoral, el entonces candidato Andrés Manuel López Obrador anunciaba que crearía la Secretaría de Seguridad Ciudadana y a quienes serían los integrantes de su gabinete de seguridad, Alfonso Durazo y Olga Sánchez Cordero. El AMLO candidato criticaba duramente al expresidente Calderón y al entonces presidente Peña Nieto por seguir una política de seguridad fallida. Reiteraba todo el tiempo que él no usaría a las Fuerzas Armadas porque no se puede combatir la violencia con violencia, él decía. También causaba polémica en esa precampaña o en esa campaña con su idea de dar amnistía a los líderes del narcotráfico para pacificar al país. Este tema duró meses en los medios. El presidente es muy bueno para imponer la agenda y para tener el control sobre ella. En ese momento, la prensa decía que 2017 había sido el año más violento de la historia, con más de 29,000 asesinatos. Un año después, en enero de 2019, ya con AMLO como presidente, comenzó a hablar de la creación de la Guardia Nacional. Tras un complejo proceso deliberativo, a principios de 2019, la Guardia Nacional quedó establecida en nuestra Constitución y explícitamente se precisó que sería una institución civil. El nuevo presidente pedía tiempo para que su estrategia diera resultados, pues aseguraba, heredamos un país descompuesto y maleado. Pero 2019 terminó siendo, una vez más, el año más violento de la historia, con un récord de 35,616 homicidios. Saltemos a enero de 2020 y encontramos un presidente bajo un severo cuestionamiento. Primero, porque la Guardia Nacional pues no es la institución civil que nos prometió. El presidente traicionó a su promesa de sacar a los militares de las tareas de seguridad. A principios de 2020, la percepción era que la Guardia Nacional se usaba para contener a los migrantes centroamericanos en la frontera sur por las presiones de Donald Trump. El crimen avanzaba y la gente no se sentía segura. Apenas unos meses antes, la salvaje masacre de varias mujeres y niños de una comunidad mormona en Chihuahua había conmocionado a México. Esto dio razones a los movimientos de víctimas a salir a las calles. Pero el presidente no los quiso escuchar. Entonces, en enero de 2020, AMLO dijo que necesitaba un año más para dar resultados. Pasó ese año y 2020 fue nuevamente uno de los años más violentos de la historia, con 35.484 homicidios, una imperceptible reducción respecto al año anterior. Estamos en enero de 2021 y ni siquiera el encierro por la contingencia sanitaria ha ayudado a reducir la violencia. Sin embargo, el presidente se mantiene firme en lo que él cree es la estrategia correcta. Esa estrategia tiene dos pilares: la Guardia Nacional y la inversión en programas sociales. Permítame ofrecer mi perspectiva de cómo están funcionando en la práctica estos dos instrumentos de la política de seguridad. Comencemos por la Guardia Nacional. En la ley, esta debería ser una institución de corte civil, comandos civiles, con capacitación policial y comprometida con el respeto a los derechos humanos. En la práctica, la gran mayoría, estoy hablando de un 80%, de los integrantes y de los mandos son militares o vienen de la carrera militar. Su presupuesto proviene de la Secretaría de la Defensa y es controlado por esta secretaría, no por Seguridad Ciudadana. Su armamento y entrenamiento es militar, están sujetos a disciplina militar. Por si fuera poco, la Guardia Nacional es la 9ª dependencia con más denuncias de violación de derechos humanos, con 209 quejas en 2020. Comparativamente, el Ejército registró 237 quejas en su contra ante la Comisión Nacional de Derechos Humanos. Para fines prácticos, la Guardia Nacional son soldados y marinos con las mismas armas, la misma operación y los mismos defectos y virtudes, pero con otro uniforme. Es, en los hechos, una cuarta rama de las Fuerzas Armadas con un escudo que casualmente es idéntico al escudo del partido político del presidente. Hay poco más de 83,000 elementos de la Guardia Nacional desplegados en territorio mexicano. Una pregunta básica es si esos 83,000 elementos están donde más se les necesita. Es decir, en los sitios más violentos, en aquellos lugares con mayor presencia de grupos criminales o en las plazas que acusan mayor debilidad institucional. México Barroa realizó un estudio muy completo que nos permitió identificar 5 zonas muy calientes en el país, es decir, 5 áreas donde se concentra la violencia homicida. Y encontramos que la Guardia Nacional no tiene presencia territorial en la gran mayoría de los municipios que forman esas áreas que exigen con urgencia la presencia del Estado. Les pongo un ejemplo. A estas concentraciones nosotros les llamamos clústeres. El clúster más violento de México está formado por 36 municipios de los estados de Michoacán y Guanajuato. Ahí se comete casi el 10% de los homicidios del país. Pero la Guardia Nacional solo tiene presencia permanente en 8 de esos 36 municipios. Así, analizando cada clúster donde se concentra esta violencia letal en el país, llegamos a una conclusión clara. La Guardia Nacional no está donde más se le necesita. Solo el 25% de los municipios en estos clústeres de concentración de violencia cuentan con presencia permanente de este cuerpo de seguridad. De 93 municipios que deberían ser prioritarios, solo 23 tienen a la Guardia Nacional. ¿Dónde está entonces este cuerpo militar? Está como el Ejército y la Marina, en todas partes. Está brindando seguridad a los hospitales en respuesta a la imparable crisis sanitaria del COVID-19. Está transportando material médico y vacunas ahora que comienzan a llegar a México. Está conteniendo a veces con violencia a los migrantes centroamericanos en la frontera sur. Está apoyando a la gente que ha sufrido la devastación de sus comunidades por inundaciones en Chiapas y Tabasco. Y está también luchando contra el sargazo en Cancún o protegiendo la vaquita marina en Baja California. Si todo es prioritario, entonces nada es prioritario. Y para la Guardia Nacional, todo parece prioritario. La Guardia Nacional está sufriendo la misma suerte del Ejército y la Marina en este gobierno. Se encarga de tantas cosas y está en tantos frentes que ya nadie sabe qué hace realmente. Regresaré a este punto más adelante. Quiero referirme ahora muy brevemente al segundo eje de la política de seguridad del actual gobierno, los programas sociales. Desde su campaña, el presidente apuntó a la desigualdad social y a la falta de oportunidades de educación y empleo para los jóvenes como el origen de la violencia criminal. La intuición del presidente no es equivocada y recuerdo muy bien que en una de las mesas de esta conferencia anual hablamos de lo importante que era atender a los jóvenes. Pero con base en esta intuición, el presidente afirmó que la inseguridad bajaría al invertir recursos públicos cuantiosos para los jóvenes mediante transferencias y becas. El diagnóstico tiene méritos. Los jóvenes entre 15 y 29 años representan pues, casi el 40% de las víctimas de homicidio en México y también de sus perpetradores. Sin embargo, los expertos en seguridad pública lo han advertido una y otra vez. No está claro que la inversión en programas sociales tenga como efecto directo la reducción de violencia y del delito. Hay dos programas que el gobierno promociona como de prevención de violencia y el delito. Uno es Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, un programa de paid internships en el que las empresas contratan a jóvenes entre 18 y 29 años como aprendices un año. A cada intern, el gobierno le da un apoyo de unos $190 al mes. Al final, cada empresa decide si ofrece empleo fijo a los jóvenes o si ahí termina su relación laboral. Y están las becas Benito Juárez, que dan apoyo en efectivo a 9 millones de estudiantes. Las becas van de los $40 al mes para estudiantes de primaria, hasta los $120 al mes para los universitarios.
Edna, perdóname, pero sí, 30 segundos para darle chance también a Ricardo. Perdón que te interrumpa, pero...
No te preocupes, Eric. Pues solamente decir que estos programas no están diseñados de acuerdo a objetivos de prevención del delito. Podemos abordar más este tema en las preguntas y respuestas, pero me voy a unas reflexiones finales. Lo primero que me preocupa es que... un segundito. Los militares no se fueron de la seguridad como nos prometieron, les cambiaron el uniforme, les pusieron el nombre de Guardia Nacional y ahora están haciendo lo que pueden para frenar la violencia, que a juzgar por las cifras no es mucho. Se les ha dado a los militares decenas de tareas. Analistas de políticas públicas, intelectuales y periodistas hablan de que se les está dando mucho poder. Pero cabe la posibilidad que en realidad se esté debilitando como nunca las Fuerzas Armadas, al exponerlas a la corrupción, al asignarles tareas que no les son naturales, al distraer su personal y equipo en tantas áreas y asuntos que pertenecen a la esfera civil. Y quiero terminar con esto. Podríamos terminar el sexenio con una Guardia Nacional ineficaz, incompleta, convertida en una superpolicía militar intimidante para los ciudadanos, pero no para los criminales, y con un ejército y una marina armada sin personal ni equipo suficiente para garantizar la defensa exterior y la seguridad interior del país. Creo que eso tendría consecuencias insospechadas para la estabilidad política y para la seguridad regional. Con eso concluyo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Edna. Thank you very much. Pasamos ahora con Ricardo Márquez, consultor independiente. Adelante, Ricardo. Estás en mute, Ricardo. O no se te escucha. Ya, ahora sí.
Perfecto. Quisiera empezar agradeciendo la invitación a Wilson Center y en particular a Duncan Wood por la invitación a formar parte de este tan distinguido panel de conocedores. Para entrar en el tema de la seguridad pública y los programas sociales. Ya Edna adelantaba un poco el planteamiento que ha hecho este gobierno sobre el tema de seguridad. Para este gobierno lo que distingue su estrategia de seguridad respecto de los anteriores gobiernos es atacar las causas de la inseguridad y de la violencia. Para esto diseñó dos ejes muy ambiciosos. El eje de los programas sociales, que ya dos de los principales programas ya los mencionaba Edna, las becas Benito Juárez y el de Jóvenes Construyendo. Y la otra, la incorporación sorprendente, desde luego, por lo que habían comentado en la campaña, la incorporación sorprendente de las Fuerzas Armadas, la plena incorporación de las Fuerzas Armadas a las labores de seguridad. Se ha avanzado muy poco, se ha analizado muy poco en un análisis integral de cómo es que las políticas sociales, en combinación con las fuerzas de seguridad, generan o pretenden generar mejores condiciones de seguridad para la ciudad. Obviamente, no existe una articulación, una coordinación entre la política social y la política de seguridad. Así que de entrada, el planteamiento inicial de este gobierno de atacar las raíces de la inseguridad a través de un ambicioso programa a través de un ambicioso conjunto de programas sociales y de incrementar de manera importante el número de elementos en labor de seguridad pública, no están conectados los dos. No solamente no están conectados, cuando se analizan de manera separada, hay serios problemas y serias deficiencias en cada uno, en el eje de los programas sociales y en el eje de seguridad. Ya mencionaba algunos de estos. Pero la integración, la generación de sinergias positivas no se está dando. Si se hiciera un análisis muy elemental, digamos, de correlación de la distribución de, ya sea de las becas Benito Juárez o de el financiamiento de Jóvenes Construyendo Futuro a nivel de Estado con los homicidios dolosos o con los otros indicadores de seguridad, se vería que no hay correlación. Hay mayor presencia donde hay mayor presencia de becas, es donde no corresponde a la mayor presencia de homicidios y viceversa. Entonces no está correlacionado estas políticas y por tanto no están generando los efectos que busca la autoridad general. Pero no solamente es eso, no es solamente que no estén generando los efectos deseados, sino que es probable que en algunos casos estén generando efectos contrarios a los deseos. Un análisis que tuve oportunidad de llevar a cabo y que tuve el honor de que se publicara en la página web de Wilson Center, donde analicé la distribución de las becas Benito Juárez y el gasto que se hacen de estos indica serias deficiencias en el control de desgasto y que muy probablemente una parte significativa de estos recursos, que son recursos públicos, que provienen de las contribuciones hacendarias, de las obligaciones fiscales de todos los ciudadanos, finalmente esté llegando a manos de las organizaciones, de las organizaciones del crimen organizado, particularmente aquellas organizaciones dedicadas al narcotráfico. Entonces, no solamente es el tema de que no hay en la práctica, no hay esta conjunción, esta implementación articulada de la política social con la política de seguridad, sino que además las deficiencias en el planteamiento de cada uno de ellas puede estar generando los efectos contrarios. Y uno de los indicadores que tenemos para ver que el tema no está caminando tan bien, particularmente en cuanto se refiere al crimen organizado, es la mayor presencia de homicidios vinculados al crimen organizado en el total de los homicidios dolosos que se cometen en el país. En el 2018, en el gobierno, al final del gobierno de Enrique Peña, se estimaba que más o menos el 43%, el 44% de todos los homicidios que se cometieron ese año estaban vinculados al crimen. Con los últimos datos que conocemos ya de diciembre, el cálculo es más o menos que el 77% del total de los homicidios que se cometen en el país están vinculados al crimen organizado. El propio presidente ha hecho su propia estimación y ha dicho que el 75% de los homicidios que se cometen en el país están vinculados al crimen organizado. Desde luego esto varía dependiendo del estado. En estados con problemas tan graves como Guanajuato, el propio secretario de Seguridad Pública de la entidad ha dicho que los homicidios están vinculados al crimen organizado, alcanzan el 90%, y en el caso de Nuevo León, el 65%. Entonces tenemos un grave problema de la violencia asociada al crimen organizado. Hasta aquí dejaría mi intervención para no excederme en los 7 minutos y dar espacio a las preguntas. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo. Unfortunately, we have limited time. The next panel begins at 11. So let me do one thing. I'll ask one of the questions from the public that I'll ask David Shirk to answer, and maybe ask you each to give a 30-second final concluding remarks on what the path forward is here. What should be the emphasis in an ideal world? David, the question coming from the audience has to do with firearms trafficking. How much does that play into the violence in Mexico, and what can be done about it? I think you have an answer in 30 seconds or less, right?
Sure. I mean, the number one source of firearms in Mexico and ammunition is the United States. We are the largest exporter of firearms. We are right next to one of the most violent scenarios in the world. And, all evidence points to the fact that the guns are coming across the border, and that flows of guns increase at times of elevated violence. So I think that we have not seen in the last 4 years any serious effort to try to contain that. And under the Obama administration, when we did see increased efforts to crack down on firearms trafficking, unfortunately, it backfired in the form of the Fast and Furious operation, which I think really killed serious efforts to control flows of firearms going across the border. But we need to, I think, reinvigorate that. On the last point, Eric's comment about what needs to be done. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about really is increasing prosecutorial capacity in Mexico, and it's an incredibly important priority. Whether we're focused on drug traffickers or ordinary random violence, less disorganized violence, as Emma called it. Mexico doesn't have the prosecutorial capacity or integrity to actually put people who commit violent crimes behind bars or administer an appropriate punishment. And so it remains the problem of accountability. The problem of impunity and the lack of accountability remains arguably the biggest problem that we're dealing with here.
Emma, you had a few ideas on policy. Can you just give us another 30, 45 seconds on that?
Sure. So ideally, I think that Mexico security policies, as well as U.S.-Mexico security cooperation should, as I said, go beyond these silver bullet short-term approaches and really push for more humane and integral responses that are also targeted, that are evidence-based, and that acknowledge, again, that not all violence is related to organized criminal organizations, and that we really need to create better diagnosis in order to foster more appropriate responses to the security crisis that we're experiencing today.
Thank you, Gemma. Edna, would you get rid of the National Guard? What would you put in its place? What's the solution? You're muted at the moment, so go ahead.
Dear Eric, I have a response.
Sí, adelante, adelante.
Sí, tengo una respuesta a tu pregunta. Yo creo que estamos poniendo muchísima atención en la Guardia Nacional. No sabemos qué está haciendo, no sabemos para qué existe, pero te puedo decir que están surgiendo respuestas desde lo local. Entre más estudio y trabajamos desde México Evalúa con policías municipales, entendemos que que hay un consenso implícito en el país. No es el consenso que promueve el presidente, es un consenso que ha sido forjando a través del tiempo y que es que los problemas se resuelven desde lo local a partir de diagnósticos muy locales y, como dijo Gemma, hay que tener la capacidad de hacer esos diagnósticos y tener la capacidad institucional para responder a estas problemáticas. Y estoy viendo en nuestro trabajo cotidiano, en nuestro trabajo de campo, Eric, que esas capacidades se están construyendo a pesar de la política federal.
Yeah. Muchas gracias. I think that's an incredibly important point here. We tend to look at the national trends, which are important, but we need to think locally. So, Ricardo, te dejo con la última palabra. Gracias. Ricardo.
Sí.
Adelante. ¿Qué propuesta final darías brevemente?
Bueno, desafortunadamente el tema de las capacidades. Se ha intentado construir capacidades, pero desafortunadamente lo que vemos con las propias cifras oficiales es que el Estado mexicano está al límite de sus capacidades. Si en este momento el Estado mexicano, el gobierno de Andrés Manuel López Obrador, decidiera poner en la calle toda la capacidad disponible para labores de seguridad pública, la capacidad que tiene no tiene más de 20,000 elementos. Y son 20,000 elementos de las Fuerzas Armadas, porque no son elementos de las policías municipales, ni son elementos de las policías estatales, ni de otro tipo de policías. La única reserva estratégica que tiene el Estado mexicano se limita a 20,000 elementos operativos de las Fuerzas Armadas. Si eso sucediera en este momento, el impacto de esos 20,000 elementos en la seguridad pública sería absolutamente nulo, nada. Entonces estamos, me parece, ante una derrota técnica del Estado mexicano ante la criminalidad y la violencia que vive nuestro país.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Thank you to all the panelists for enlightening us today. There's a lot more to discuss, but we'll have further panels to talk about some of these issues. Thank you, Andrew, for your patience, and I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Eric. No need to thank me for being patient. Great panel. Thank you, Eric, for putting it together, and to our speakers, David, Edna, Gemma, and Ricardo. Thank you very much for being here this morning. And I regret that we have to move on, but that just suggests opportunities for further discussion on this topic. So let's move to our second panel, On the Ground, Mexico's Security Landscape, which will be moderated by Stephen Dudley. Just a quick intro of Stephen. He's the co-founder and co-director of Insight Crime and a senior fellow at American University Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. He's the former bureau chief of the Miami Herald in the Andean region and the author of Walking Ghosts, Murder and Guerrilla Politics in Colombia. Stephen has also reported from Haiti, Brazil, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Miami for National Public Radio and the Washington Post, among others. He has a BA in Latin American history from Cornell and an MA in Latin American studies from University of Texas, Austin. He was awarded the Knight Fellowship at Stanford and is a member of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And from 2012 to 2013, he was a visiting fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. His second book, MS-13, The Making of the World's Most Notorious Gang, was published in September 2020. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Good morning to everybody, far and near. Hope everybody is well in these crazy times. Thought we could just jump right into it after a couple of logistic items here. First, for the panelists, just try and keep your answers brief enough to allow for participation of everybody. If you go on a little bit, I will remind you via our shared chat there on Zoom. The other thing is for the audience. If you have questions, you can submit them via an email, mexico@wilsoncenter.org, or via the Twitter handle @Mexico Institute. We've got a fantastic lineup today. So I'll jump right in and do a couple of bios here. I'm seeing Deb and I'm seeing Angela. I'm not yet seeing Ian, but hopefully he'll get on in a minute here. We've got Deb Roneo. Deb is the senior editor of Vice World News Latin America. She previously served as a staff video journalist for the Financial Times and Los Angeles Times, and as a freelance journalist based in Mexico City. Deb has produced video reports for publications, including The Economist, Time Magazine, AFP, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, PRI, The World, Univision, the BBC, Global Post, and I should add, Insight Crime, including last year producing a fantastic story for Insight Crime on wood trafficking in Chihuahua. She's also been listed by Foreign Policy Magazine as one of the 100 most influential female tweeters, which is a foreign land for me. So, but I think that's fantastic, Deb. Thank you so much for being with us. We've also got Angela Corchega. Angela is a news director and correspondent for public radio station KTP in El Paso, covering the Southwest border region for local listeners and beyond. She has reported on major stories on the border in Mexico, ranging from the plight of child migrants to the impact of drug violence on families to the current COVID-19 pandemic. We'll certainly talk a little bit about that. She's a 2019 Maria Moores Cabot medalist from the Columbia School of Journalism for courageous reporting and contributing to inter-American understanding. Before returning to her roots in public radio, she served as both bureau chief in Mexico City and later on the border in El Paso for a group of leading US television stations. She has spent years reporting on the US border security buildup, fight over the wall, and emergence of militia groups. In Mexico, she has reported on the drug war, disappeared, and mass murders with continuous coverage on the ground in Ciudad Juarez. She lives on the edge of West Texas, New Mexico, and Chihuahua, and calls the borderland home. Just checking to see if we have Ian, which we don't. So let's just jump right in with Deb and Angela. I'm very familiar with Deb because I worked with her, so forgive me for my familiarity with her. But I wanted to actually jump in with Angela, and I'm going to ask you guys both this question, which is just thinking back on 2020, obviously a very strange year. And from your patches, what you guys saw, in particular, if you could just tell me, Angela, what was the most important security-related story you did, and why would you say it was the most important security-related story you did?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled to be on this panel with so many I admire, and this is an important discussion, and we'll get right to it. By important, I think really the intersection of all the things we cover on the border, from the border security aspect, the health crisis, and of course the migration crisis. We saw that intersection, and we can't forget the, I'll throw it in there, not because it's the most important, but because it proved to be the most ineffective way of dealing with any of these things, is the border wall, which of course, starting tomorrow, construction will stop. It was not effective in stopping migration, the asylum humanitarian crisis, because people would go right up to the wall and peek in and ask Border Patrol to let them in and get asylum. And the wall, for those who don't realize it, or fence or steel slats, whatever we're calling it now, the barrier is completely on U.S. soil. So it's by the time you reach that barrier, you're in the U.S. As far as COVID, we have travel restrictions at the border, and that really has impacted us for legal travel for people to come in. Essential travel is all you can do for work, school, which is essentially now remote, and possibly medical care. And so in that respect, trade is coming through. We see trade up in trucks, but also, organized crime has adapted very effectively. U.S. citizens are now the ones smuggling small quantities of drugs, the potent drugs that are coming through ports of entry. So the wall is probably the most important story, not because it was effective, but because it was the focus of this past administration and really overshadowed everything.
Thanks. Deb, what do you think? Well, what was the most important thing you either covered or edited? Because I know you've moved to more of an editing position, but you did do some really impactful stories over 2020 as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were two things I would mention. One would be the whole undocumented immigrant crisis that we see unfolding, not just at the border and throughout Mexico. I think, all sorts of things, the closure of borders in Central America, AMLO's relationship with former President Trump, and his sort of roundabout turn on migrants, I think increased the vulnerability of them both to organized crime, corrupt law enforcement. Just this weekend, you saw that they found 19 burned bodies in Tamaulipas, and some of those are thought to be teenage migrants from Guatemala. So that was one thing I think that needs emphasis, as people as policymakers debate this, the vulnerability of those people in Mexico is extraordinary. And organized crime and people smugglers are definitely jumping on that as a criminal opportunity. I would say the other story and it's the story that keeps on giving, is this the case around Mexico's former defense chief, Cienfuegos, who you all may or may not know was arrested by the Americans in Los Angeles. I think it was in October or November last year, on charges of collaborating with a fairly unknown drug cartel in Mexico. And in unprecedented events, the Americans ended up dropping the charges, sending Cienfuegos back to Mexico to face justice here. And then it emerged in 2021 that Mexico actually isn't going to prosecute him at all. There are no charges. Doesn't seem to have been much of an investigation, but it's been super interesting in terms of what it's revealed about the US-Mexico security relationship, Andres Manuel's attitude towards that, and how it feeds into his kind of nationalist populist stance. And that has huge implications going forward as Biden moves into the presidency in terms of how the Mexico security relationship is going to work. I mean, I'm not that old, but I've been around, and I've never seen Mexico threaten to throw out the DEA. All of this went on behind closed doors, but we got that tip on very solid ground. And I'd never seen that before. So I think it shows that AMLO is definitely drawing a line in the sand and sort of trying to distinguish himself from Calderon and Peña Nieto and the other presidents who oversaw the drug war. And I think that's fascinating.
Thanks, Angela. I just wanted to pick up on something that Deb said, which was about migration. And you're on the border. You mentioned the wall. Have you also felt this or seen this in your reporting, that the migrants that have been moving up north and then obviously subsequently pushed back into Mexico, are they more vulnerable? Has this made for a different kind of criminal economy along the border? What have you seen?
Yeah, it's accelerated the existing tragedy of human smuggling, and people used as bargaining chips and pawns and human cargo. And these organized crime, somebody told me years ago that, it's more profitable than drugs because especially now with Title 42, which means because of the pandemic, people are removed quickly and sent back across the border to Mexico, which is not their home country. They're often given 3 shots to get across. So what happens is, the profits continue, and the people who we're not going to say deported because they're just removed, can continually be paid to get across. They're also held hostage. They're kidnapped on both sides of the border. Their families are told to send money or they'll be killed. And of course, we saw the horrible tragedy that Deb talked about in Camargo, and we're likely to see more about that, more of that because of these smuggling routes. The fight over these smuggling routes and these migrants being used as pawns and just, currency really. So we have all these people in the Remain in Mexico, migrant protection protocols, which migrants would argue there's no protection, who are really, really vulnerable, not just to COVID, but to organized crime. In some cases, the halcones or the lookouts are actually in the shelters, and not just keeping an eye on the migrants, but actively recruiting them, because after you run out of money and you have no family support, here's your choice, come join us, or else you might become one of our victims. So yes, the tragedies become worse. You have a humanitarian crisis and a security crisis.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Angela. Thinking about these criminal economies that have emerged on the border and how they're related to the previous panel, which is violence. Certainly one of the themes, at least in the decade that I've been covering Mexico, is this atomization of criminal organizations. What do you see along the border as it relates to atomization? How does that manifest itself along the border?
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned I'm on the border. I'm about 10 minutes from the border, and I don't have to call sources at CBP or others in Mexico to see, that illegal crossings or smuggling is happening, because I hear a CBP helicopter. They increase daily, and I can tell there's more activity. I'm about 10 minutes from the border fence. I'm right on the edge of Texas near New Mexico. And so, yes, there is more activity. There's more opportunity for profit. There's more opportunity for these groups to break off into, and specialize, which we know they have, not just in small scale, fentanyl and other drugs that they move through ports of entry, but how they move people across. The other tragedy we've seen is more injuries and deaths from people trying to go over the very tall border fence wall in our area. There's about 3 a week, and some very serious injuries and deaths, including a pregnant woman who fell off the wall and died. So yes, these groups are going to move people through. They are breaking away. For us, though, it's not as much who's in charge. The Juarez cartel's not going anywhere. They live in Juarez, and we saw, despite that horrible, brutal, bloody war a few years ago, they're still here, and still standing. But on the periphery, you may have other groups and skirmishes and fights, and that violence does take a toll on local populations.
Just one more follow there. Do you get a sense that, for example, the Juarez cartel, does it still exist? I mean, what is it? How would you describe it today?
It exists. The name may change. Clearly the people, they constantly have to recruit as people are murdered and die off or fight. But again, I've had conversations with multiple DEA people in charge in this area. Where is the Juarez cartel going to go? This is a home, and people are involved in all levels, and people, not just the sicarios, but the people involved in moving money, the people involved in moving drugs, the people involved in moving migrants. So it's not going anywhere. The name may change. It may take different shapes. The leadership may change. But for those who live here, it's not so much who's in charge, but the consequences and how violent will be. And a barometer is to see how many police are killed, because once you have warfare within police departments, things are brewing, and we're going to have another horrible wave of violence.
Yeah, I want to turn to you, Deb. Obviously, you've raised your hand, and well, it's
I just wanted to add.
No, I think it's great. Jump in. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add to something Angela was talking about. Our reporter Emily Green was just in Matamoros in the asylum camp there, and even there you can feel organized crime. She said that La Maña, the criminal groups, were inside the camps, even though those camps are guarded by security and sort of auspiciously, run by the government or non-profits. And you can't do anything without getting permission. You can't try and cross the Rio Grande. You have to get permission for everything. It wasn't clear to her whether they're part of the Gulf Cartel, which I assume is the main power there, or whether it's sort of a fledgling group that has just sprung up because of the very special opportunity that those camps offer. But yeah, as we know, organized crime just sees an opportunity in people's misfortune. And for them, those people who are stuck there in limbo are another profit margin, I think.
I guess I'm wondering from your perspective, Deb, you see this as kind of a top-down? You said the Gulf Cartel, but again, is this a top-down thing, or are these just a smattering of groups that like to put themselves under an umbrella because it's more effective? It might keep authorities away. It might make it easier for them to kidnap and extort. What's your sense?
It's hard to know, and Emily's reporting there was based more on asylum seekers than it was on the criminal dynamics. But having spent a little bit of time on the border myself and having a lot of friends who've also done the same, I think that the control of that region is pretty much blanket. And when I was in Tijuana at the end of last year, the Jalisco new generation is now reportedly in control of the border with Tecate, and all across the international line, as much as for the drug trade as for moving people across. It's all controlled by different groups. So whether those groups are in the camps or whether the groups in the camps are paying those bigger groups, I don't know. But the other thing, and I don't think this is just anecdotal, before the end of the year, I was also looking into drug seizures on the southwest border. And the seizures of meth during lockdown have surged, which is super interesting. Now, that could be because there's less traffic going through the border, so the vigilance is better, and Homeland Security and CBP are catching more drugs, or it could be because business is just as usual booming for the cartels despite the lockdown. But I thought that was super interesting as well, just in terms of like how you've seen organized crime respond to the quote unquote lockdown in Mexico, which, as you can imagine, is rather loose.
Yeah, and obviously that's the new variable here in 2020 that we don't have prior. You've seen that aspect uptick in the amount of meth captured for reasons unknown. And I know you don't have the answer to this because I get asked this a lot too, and I don't either. But what are some of the other things that you would, flag up in the COVID environment that we should be looking at?
I'd say the products tied to COVID and the counterfeit products being moved across the border in both directions. We had everything from early on the hand sanitizer, even some toilet paper, if you can believe that, in the early days of the pandemic when that was coming in from Mexico and being seized because the sanitizer wasn't, was in unmarked bottles and not properly imported, to COVID tests that were found going into Mexico, because as we know, Mexico does not do widespread testing. It was unclear if those were even legitimate tests. And now there's a real concern. The FBI put out a warning about counterfeit vaccinations. So adapting to what the hot commodity is and how organized crime can fill that black market gap. And lastly, I'll just mention, we had Ley Seca here, and I know you did in Mexico City too. Have brother living in Mexico City, it was hard for people who were stuck at home to even buy a bottle of wine. He said, I could probably buy marijuana, which he doesn't use, easier in Mexico City right now than I could, a bottle of wine when I'm stuck at home. And of course, in the US, alcohol was not, there was no Ley Seca when they realized people were cooped up. So of course we had clandestine alcohol in Juarez and parties, and so organized crime moving in to fill that need. So adapting very quickly.
What do you see in, Deb, in your parts?
I mean, it's interesting, at the beginning of COVID, we did some reporting about, the breakdown of the global supply chain and, shortages of precursors to make meth and fentanyl, but those were really, really short-lived. The violence in Mexico has carried on unabated despite lockdown, which I think is also interesting. And a reflection of just kind of the lack of rule of law that you see in Mexico and the inability of the Mexican government to really create mandates that people follow. And as you all know, COVID here is ravaging the country. We're still in code red here in Mexico. But also I think an editor sent me an email from London the other day saying, have the narcos stolen the vaccines yet? The answer to that was no, but I think we are all very pendiente to see what, we saw the cartels with fentanyl, synthesizing a legal pharmaceutical. So I am sort of curious to see if and what organized crime should choose to do with the vaccines. I'm sure there will be black market elements of this. I think it's still too early to tell. Mexico has only started importing the vaccine about 2 or 3 weeks ago. But I think the other interesting thing is, across Latin America, you did see criminal groups enforcing lockdown where governments simply couldn't. And I think the social capital of organized crime in Latin America is very famous. And in these states where, this is a lower cartel and especially the Jalisco and Gulf cartels as well, have such sort of political power, I think their importance has probably increased. But because of the logistics of reporting these things and the lack of eyes on the ground, I'm sort of speculating, but that would be my feeling. You've seen cartels historically going around handing out food supplies and gifts at Christmas and all those sorts of things. So I wonder if they have kind of stepped in to also create a social function during COVID, especially with the absence of the state in so many parts of the country.
Does it look a little PR-ish to you, though, at the same time? I mean, of course, it's very easy you have a lot of disposable income. You can hand out a lot of things. Does it feel a little PR-ish, a little set up and a little overblown? Or do you think this idea of criminal governance, it's really what we're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg, and that beneath that, there is a real criminal governance happening?
I mean, I think there is a lot of PR and social media outreach on the part of all the criminal organizations to look like they have this kind of benefactor characteristic. But, we all know, and I think it's obvious that comes in exchange for something. They are not altruists by any means. And I think that kind of goes without saying. But, in states like Tamaulipas, again, where we saw that migrant massacre, that state has long been under the control of organized crime. And we know that. And we've seen the indictment and prosecution of former governors there who worked with the Zetas cartel, who worked with the Gulf cartel to sort of aid and abet their criminal activities. But, I think criminal governance is very real. And I think, if anything, it's probably been strengthened under COVID, just because you have this lack of movement and lack of presence of law enforcement.
Angela, I wanted to piggyback a little bit on this to talk about and jump back to what was mentioned earlier, and this idea about, Cienfuegos. It wasn't necessarily mentioned in this way, but certainly there is a notion, and you're a person who has covered Mexico now for decades, and there is a notion of this, completely integrated nature of organized crime with political parties and the state. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm wondering, when you see cases like the Garcia Luna case or the Cienfuegos case, or really I would put Cienfuegos case maybe in the Nayarit case study sort of pocket, a kind of entire state government that was usurped. How do you see those interactions between criminal groups and the state or forces that are running the state? How has that evolved, especially recently? What should we be taking away from these cases?
Well, and we don't have to look too far where I am. Chihuahua's had its share of problems, and the previous governor, Cesar Duarte, who was a fugitive, finally taken into custody, but unclear what kind of charges, what will happen to him in Mexico after he was sent back. So no, we see that periodically, and we have a changing of a guard. We have these political vacuums when new politicians, new leadership comes in. But people here are disillusioned and demoralized when it comes to their leadership. And you do see, as I mentioned previously too, you can see where this war within these states happens at the state and local police municipal level, as they literally go after each other. And that's always kind of a heads up for us that, the breakdown is happening when police murders increase. And also the murder of journalists. Deb mentioned, Tamaulipas has been a zone of silence for years, for absolute years, because you cannot cover anything there. Juarez, has had its share of journalists murdered, but there still is some freedom to report. But that also creates this terror and this unknown and really hinders investigations because, even the general public doesn't know exactly what's going on. But, total lack of confidence and a real concern about the integration of state, especially state and local governments into criminal organizations.
Are we looking at this wrong, Angela? I mean, do we have this wrong when we kind of look at it in a very binary way? We look at, the state goes after criminal groups and the criminal groups penetrate the state. Should we be looking at it differently? Maybe the state or elements of the state are using the criminal groups as kind of extensions of their own power rather than the other way around?
I think it's both, and I would love to hear you weigh in because your expertise is in this area. But I think it isn't one way. I think it's both in both directions, unfortunately, and federal in some cases too. And I talked about murders of journalists. Often, they'll say, "Oh, cartels are criminal organizations," but often these are people who went up against state officials or local officials and ended up getting murdered.
What do you think, Deb, on this point?
I agree. I think the narrative, the dominant narratives on the relationship between organized crime and the state is very like, the big bad cartels corrupting well-meaning governments. And I just think that's extraordinarily naive. And you can see that in Mexico, you can see that in Central America, Honduras, all these, major cocaine transit countries. There is a mutual benefit to both sides, not just in terms of political power, but in terms of financial as well. And I think what's really interesting about the Cienfuegos debacle is you're seeing, an anti-corruption president defending his highest military authority from very serious and I think credible charges in the US for collaborating with the drug cartel, largely in his own interest because he is himself so dependent on the military. But the military and its power in Mexico to aid and abet and control, it's not as simple as the drug cartel showing up at the barracks and paying off the local general. I mean, these relationships are mutually beneficial and go right to the top. Now, it's not for me to say whether Cienfuegos charges are real or not, or right or wrong, but I think it does serve as an example of this codependency. And then you see, heads of state relying so heavily on the security apparatus. And I think all of those dynamics are very, very gray. And I don't think organized crime is always the aggressor because the benefits are so mutual.
Yeah, and certainly in the Nayarit case or the Cienfuegos case, which seemed to come from the Nayarit case, we're talking about a deputy or an acting attorney general for the state, and obviously the governor, who were working for years doing this. So, obviously there's an integration of the military component and then the political component. So you've got a mix of actors for sure.
I think it's also super nuanced, right? Because you remember in Guanajuato, they arrested the sledgehammer El Maro. I think it was in August last year when violence in that state was a pretty severe high, and actually still continues to be. But I do remember when they took out El Maro, he was kind of going at it with the Jalisco cartel, which, as you know, has aggressively expanded across Mexico. And so, you do want to ask yourself, well, why are you taking out the leader of the Santa Lima cartel? And, now Jalisco has fragmented in Guanajuato and there's all sorts of other types of violence happening. But, the strategies that governments take and the groups that they decide to go after also reflects dynamics that are going on behind closed doors, I think.
And lastly, I mean, you do see candidates too funded by cartel organizations, and even locally people whispering about narco candidates openly running for office. So it is in both directions, and they become one.
I just want to welcome Ian Griot, who has blessed us with his presence after a long mid-morning nap. No, just kidding, Ian. Great to have you. Ian, of course, is a tremendous longtime reporter from, based in Mexico City, but certainly covering well beyond there. Lots of crime and organized crime issues around the region, written for Time, Esquire, CNN, Reuters, Al Jazeera, Houston Chronicle, Associated Press, author of several books, Blood, Gun Money, How America Arms Gangs and Cartels, Gangster Warlords, Drug Dollars, Killing Fields, and the New Politics of Latin America, and last but not least, El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency. There, Ian, just before you jump in to kind of get you caught up, we were just talking about dominant narratives. I know back in your early work there, you did posit this theory of a criminal insurgency, which is itself a narrative that says that there is this kind of, evil outside force that is trying to usurp or overcome the state, or in some instances, become the state. How has your own thinking as it relates to the narco narrative evolved in Mexico in the last decade?
Hey, Steve, thanks for the introduction. And hey, Deborah, Angela, all the Mexico Institute, very sorry for the late coming on there, but good to be here. So I wrote my first book published in 2011, and that was during the kind of biggest sharp increase in violence. Between 2008 and 2011 was when we saw the real explosion of violence in Mexico, and the numbers, like blamed on cartels or the security forces fighting cartels, going up, from rapidly in a few years, from like 2,000 in a year to 15,000 in a year, like eightfold. And then we saw the big, large, heavy homicide levels continuing. And we saw very extraordinary things happening in these years. So suddenly, I was covering this since around 2001. I arrived in Mexico in 2000, began covering this in 2001. And suddenly around that time period, we started seeing very extraordinary things happening with the violence. So we saw things like the massacre of 72 migrants in San Fernando, then the mass graves of 197 bodies there. We saw things like in Michoacan, 500 gunmen fighting 2,000 federal forces. We saw things, then continuing of cartel people shooting down military helicopters. So really the insurgency comparison was like saying this has gone beyond what you can understand by regular criminality. How can we make sense of what's happening in Mexico? How can you make sense of over 12-year period, 300,000 murders? How can you make sense of things like a regular middle-class housing estate in Veracruz, and then next to it, a mass grave with 250 bodies right next to that in a cow field right next to this? So this idea is that the groups, the criminal organizations, are beyond just drug traffickers, just criminals, to complicated things. I mean, with very diverse amounts of businesses taking control of levels of power in these areas. Now, my second book, I called it Gangster Warlords, and I kind of carried on this comparison a bit. The thing about the cartels is that they can work both with the state and they can fight the state. So a lot of the time, these kind of warlords in these areas are working and are very entwined with the state. And this is something which all of us covering this, I think, have followed and written about for time, how the Mexican government apparatus have been mixed up with drug traffickers since the very early days, and going right back to like 1916 in the very first cases. What we're seeing now, and now we're kind of, one of the things about, I guess, the use of insurgency or use of, I still think we lack a vocabulary, a very good vocabulary to talk about this. what's happening in Mexico and many parts of Latin America, to make sense of it. This idea of a kind of weird hybrid place between crime and war that you see. So to talk about it as a regular war, I think it kind of falls apart as well. When you try and understand this irregular war, people kind of say there's a war in Mexico right now, a regular war in Mexico right now, and we have to apply kind of international legal standards to that. But also understand this is purely a criminal situation goes as well. I mean, you cannot ignore when you have things like Culiacanazo happening, when you have 700 gunmen taking to the streets and fronting off against 350 soldiers and the government backing down on these things. You have to look at this situation as being something extraordinary. So I think kind of weird hybrid of crime and war, I think we still need to catch up with a vocabulary for this, but also with government policies that can work with this, that can find. I mean, let's face it, not only have the current Mexican president and 3 previous Mexican presidents failed on security, but also the international organizations haven't offered really a working alternative to their plan as well.
You know, I want to turn this a little bit towards U.S.-Mexico relations, and I'll give you, Ian, the first shot at this because you jumped on late. But I'm interested in why the Garcia Luna case in the United States played out, you think, so differently from the Cienfuegos case. You know, why was there no, protest about Garcia Luna, but there was mounds of protest about Cienfuegos, and even brought him all the way back and basically exonerated him? Why do you think there is that difference? And what does that tell us about US-Mexico relations?
So first of all, I think with going after Garcia Luna, Cienfuegos, and some other political targets, I think this is kind of a logical evolution of what the US drug enforcement is doing. Like, for a long time, since the 1970s, when the DEA was formed, and you have this idea, okay, you can't go after the nickel and dime drug dealers on the corner, you have to go up to the big drug traffickers. So you see that evolve over the years, and really El Chapo was the ultimate accumulation of that. I mean, Pablo Escobar was taken down in '93, but that wasn't really a DEA thing. That was a Colombian operation, with some American help. But El Chapo was really the accumulation of decades of US drug policy. Go after the ultimate kingpin. So you see in the trial of El Chapo, where they throw in dozens and dozens of witnesses and claim that he made $14 billion and have a 3-month massive show trial. And that was like, we're really taking down these drug traffickers. Then after that, where do you go? After that, where do these agents go after they've taken down the ultimate drug trafficker? So something that, as journalists, we criticized for a long time. And we said, well, you can't just take down the drug traffickers. You also need to take down the political protection of drug traffickers. So the kind of logical step then is okay, now we've taken down ultimate kingpins, let's take out political protection. Now, the difference between Garcia Luna and Cienfuegos, a big obvious difference is the political connections of them. Garcia Luna was very heavily connected to the Calderon administration, was now out to kind of lost his political connections inside, was very US based, and made his own connections with the security establishment in the United States. And I think the case against Garcia Luna is likely, from what we understand, much stronger. Cienfuegos, and we have to look at this case, there does seem to be very problems with the evidence presented, genuine problems with the evidence presented. But Cienfuegos also is still tied to a Mexican military establishment, which is very close to this current administration. And the idea is the administration doesn't want to allow the DEA to go after all of its Mexican generals and all Mexican military apparatus. So they want to put a stop to this. I think that's part of the big difference there.
I also think, Steve,
go ahead, Deb. Yeah.
I think there's also this perception in Mexico, which is, right or wrong, the military is still quite a sacred institution that, according to polls, is the most trusted sort of public security branch. it's arguable whether it should be public or not. But I think the police has been so derided and so discredited, both by, you know, AMLO and by, you know, evidence, that they're kind of easier to go after. And I think that's also why you didn't see the kind of pushback on the Garcia Luna case that you saw on Cienfuegos. And as Johan says, the fact that AMLO is still so almost like, you know, 80% reliant on the military now, that he can't afford for Cienfuegos to be made an example of. But it's also because of that public perception, I think, of those different security branches.
Can I jump in, Dudley?
Sure.
I wanted to, Stephen, talk about the insurgency on the border on the U.S. side and the militia groups here. We have to look at it on both sides that have been forming and active. We had one near the border wall here. It looked like a ragtag group of incompetent people, but they were heavily funded and they were tied to that We Build the Wall group that ended up being part of a criminal, you know, case, which of course now Steve Bannon's been pardoned. But so working hand in hand to stop immigration, and they were actively taking people, as they put it, citizen arrests. Now you may say, okay, that's limited to the border, but it is a problem. You know, it's not just security across borders, but at the border. And we had a lone gunman come in and do a mass shooting at a Walmart, and you know, part of a white supremacist attack. And we again saw how that has blown up and ended up. We see that that is a threat from within. Now we saw that at the U.S. Capitol. So we need to look at security at the border as well as across borders, I think.
What expectations do you have as it relates to U.S.-Mexico relations with the shift in administrations? And I'll start with you, Angela, because you were just speaking. But what are your thoughts on where this is going, especially considering the last few days with the Cienfuegos case, really the last few months, and how it seemed to be like they were burying this case in the middle of this transition, very chaotic transition. You know, let's just put out this news and just get it done with before the new administration comes in. Maybe no one will notice. What's your sense of where that's going?
Well, I think that there is a real understanding. It's a new day, and it's going to go back to more of a, you know, agency to agency at all levels, and not just personality driven by the two presidents who obviously saw eye to eye in many ways. So I think that there's a real concern that, you know, things that could have been agreed upon in a quick phone call, now there's going to be some real diplomacy, and you can hear my dogs barking. So that I think is going to create a problem. But for people who want to get things done quickly, as far as AMLO goes. But as Deb mentioned too, there's a real concern about the law enforcement breakdown, because DEA, you know, now is at risk of not being able to operate in Mexico. And we've seen waves of this, but this probably is one of the most serious challenges we've seen recently.
Yeah, great to have your dogs, by the way. Deb, just before you jump in, there is a question very much related to this, so I'll throw it in there so you have it in mind. And that is, what do you think? This is from Alicia Azzi. What do you think of Mexico's new law severely restricting the operations of foreign law enforcement agents in Mexico? How will this affect the U.S., if at all? So maybe keep that in mind while you're answering the larger question.
I mean, I think Mexico-US relations on security are kind of at an extraordinary time because of the DEA incident and the pushback on Cienfuegos. One of the other things that we heard was on the table was that when they were sort of negotiating what was going to happen with Cienfuegos, was that Mexico wanted Mexican agents to have a reciprocal relationship in the United States. So as you have DEA here, they would want the equivalent of their investigative police there, which, I mean, clearly has all sorts of implications for Mexico's, you know, organized criminal organizations and what have you, because we do know that corruption is a problem on both sides of the border, but it's particularly pronounced here. But I think, you know, going forward, you're going to see, you know, I think AMLO and Biden have had a conversation already, but something like Merida, you know, what is that going to look like going forward, which is the basis of this money that the US gives Mexico for security cooperation. If relations are, you know, tense, which I would argue they will be because of the Cienfuegos issue, then I think I would be interested to see how that initiative looks like going forward, you know, whether Biden in turn is going to enforce those human rights requirements that are part of that legislation, to part of that agreement, you know. So I think it's super interesting. And I also think when you look at AMLO's security strategy, which has moved away from like a full-on confrontational approach in the way that you saw with Peña Nieto and Calderón, despite the fact that he is doing these crazy things like the Culiacan incident that happened, and they are continuing to arrest people. His message is very different. And I think part of that is because he recognizes that the narco is a product of El Pueblo, which shows his support base. He understands that drug trafficking and organized crime comes from poverty and need. But even though he's changed that rhetoric, I don't see any, like, there is no sort of clear plan of how they're going to bring down homicides and improve public security. And that is a huge problem going forward. And it's something that affects not just Mexico, but the US on the border as well. And I'm curious to see where he goes and whether he comes up with any ideas.
I'm going to throw one more layer on this, Ian, before you get a chance to jump in. And that is, there have been certain experiments, judicial experiments that have been tried in other parts of the region, in Guatemala and Honduras specifically. So sort of supranational judicial bodies come in under the auspices of the United Nations or Organization of American States, and they try and go after these kind of untouchable figures inside of the state, you know, very often military generals, you know, and certainly, you know, the Cienfuegos case raises the specter of just massive and top-down infiltration of the military bracket inside of Mexico. Should we be looking or considering at these, and this is a question from the audience, should we be considering these kind of, you know, regional attempts to deal with the issue of drug trafficking organizations in Mexico and their, you know, their proxies inside of the government, or vice versa, as we were talking about before? How should we be maybe considering this in a different way and not just a sort of US question?
Yeah, so I'll go at a little bit on the issue of the US-Mexico cooperation and the DEA agents. So if we look at the reality now is that the DEA agents are going to have more difficulty going after the big targets of Mexican drug traffickers, and particularly after Mexican officials connected to drug traffickers. I mean, there's an attempt to, they're not being kicked out of the country, but there's an attempt to say, well, any information you find about it, we want to know exactly what it is, so that really limits what they can do operationally. Now, you've got a difficult situation where the strategy itself is not working anyway in terms of reducing the violence in Mexico. I mean, obviously, we've seen very, very high levels of Mexican violence, or reducing drugs in the United States, and we're seeing record levels of overdose deaths of drugs in the United States. So fundamentally, you've got changes now to a strategy that's actually not working in the first place anyway. Now, it's a tricky situation, because on one side, when you have figures like El Chapo, and although I think many of us would agree that taking down these figures doesn't work and it just can provoke more violence, at the same time, we don't want impunity and these people to be going around and being able to carry out particularly horrific crimes of kidnapping and all these kind of things and not be attacked. So not be taken down. And so you're kind of limiting taking down these kind of mastermind criminals who can gain more power, and also with the state there. What I would like to see would be on both sides of the border, people trying to look at a bigger strategy that can actually work. So beginning with harm reduction. I mean, we have to really rethink the war on drugs idea as a concept, which we have in the public conversation, but we're still, in terms of policy, still have the DEA, still have the idea of bringing this down, still have very little addiction and rehabilitation treatment for addicts. So like when you have, supposedly according to the American Medical Association, only 10% of people in the United States who have problems getting the help they need, then just giving the help they need could start to reduce the drug money going down, funding these organizations. In Mexico, what I'd like to see, and as Deborah said, we don't have this clearly shown at all, but a policy based on the reduction of antisocial crimes, being murder, extortion, kidnapping, and those three. Like any law enforcement, you have to have priorities and focus. The idea you said about bringing, and it's an interesting question, and again, about the idea of, if Mexico is a narco state, or if elements of Mexico are a narco state, if you have generals or governors who are protected by the institution of the state carrying out crimes, down to things like the massacre of students in Ayotzinapa or in Iguala, then should you bring in international bodies to oversee that? The problem is with that is, this in a way comes a little bit back to when globalization was being more successful, and you had the idea of the International Criminal Court at The Hague, and they can, if governments can't help themselves, they can take them down. But we've seen a kind of crumbling of that, and we've seen cases, worse cases of Syria, Russia, many countries. The United States itself, European countries themselves, committing a lot of bad crimes and not being held accountable for it. So the idea, I think, of kind of Mexico, it's a very complicated, messy case. You could really bring in some kind of international jurisdiction and try all the former presidents of Mexico. It seems a very, very tough call. Maybe have some, groups coming in, like with Ayotzinapa, you had these international groups helping with investigations. But I think you probably need Mexico in its as a national country to try and reinvigorate the state here and solve these problems.
The other thing I'd add, Steve, to do with the US-Mexico relationship, and obviously this is anecdotal because there's not that much studies on it, but my reporting, I had a conversation with one of our reporters, Nathaniel, who's done a lot, Nathaniel Janowitz, who's done a lot on organized crime and drug use in Mexico as well. Be interested to hear what you think, Johan. But a lot of the violence being generated in Mexico now, I don't know how long ago, maybe 10, 20 years, most of that was to do with protecting smuggling routes and getting across the border. But increasingly, Guanajuato, Guadalajara, Zacatecas, Aguascalientes, the violence that you're seeing there from my interviews is to do with protecting local drug sales. Cristal or methamphetamine in Mexico, the use here has exploded. And I think the violence related to drug trafficking isn't just about the US market in Mexico, whereas it might have been more to do with that however many years ago. But that is a massive factor for why you have so many homicides now in states like Guanajuato. It's territorial disputes, but not just about, moving product north, but about who controls the street sales spots in those cities.
And that's what happened in Juarez as well. And I would agree with both of you that it's not, security is also tied to health issues like addiction, but also economic issues. And we're seeing with COVID, with so many people out of work, that it's a fertile recruiting ground for new members of organized crime.
It's so great, all great points. We have about 5 minutes left. So I just want to do one last round. And it's related to a question an editor I had at the Washington Post used to ask me, which was, what are we going to be, he would always say at the beginning of the year, what are we going to be talking about at the end of the year? Or maybe we could say in this case, in next year's Mexico Institute annual conference on security, what are we going to be talking about from 2021? What are the things that we're going to be talking about? Why don't we start with you, Angela?
I think we're going to be looking at the intersection of organized crime and migration again. And because of all the upheaval and how the border is going to be handled, and these ideas, these surges in migration, the concerns about, people thinking now's their time to come across, and organized crime taking advantage and encouraging people and obviously profiting from migrants trying to make it to the US.
Terrific. Ian, why don't you go ahead?
I think we'll be talking about the Mexican military and National Guard. I think they'll be taking a bigger and bigger role, and we'll see, might just to see that playing out this year. I think we'll be continuing to talk about strained US-Mexican relationships on security or something happening on that angle. And something out there, I think also we'll be looking at we've seen an increase in violence in US cities. And we've seen actually, a couple of years now, a kind of rebound of violence in the United States. And I think that changes the relationship, somewhat. During a long period where Mexican violence was going up really, really high, US violence was going down. And that's part of the reason why this dynamic was seen. And I think that's starting to change. So we're starting to see more kind of violence on both sides of the borders. And on both sides of the borders, as Deborah said, and I agree, more linked to local drug selling as well.
Thanks. Deb?
Right. Thanks for coming to me last, by the way, Steve, because now I have to think of something new. I would say I agree with everything Angela and Johan said. I'm actually really curious to see how AMLO implements these new limitations for US security agents in Mexico, because as we know, Mexico has plenty of rules and laws, but it doesn't really implement them very well. So I think, in 12 months' time, it will be very interesting to look at, now AMLO has made that promise, how the US's security role in Mexico plays out, I think.
Terrific. Thank you so much to the three of you, not just for this great panel, but also for all the work that you do and all the coverage that you continue to give us. And we will be watching very closely, I'm sure, during this year. So thanks again to all three. I'm going to pass now this back to Andrew, and we'll continue the proceedings. Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care of yourselves.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks. Do the best there.
Steve, thank you. And thanks to all the panelists, really, with Stephen's moderation, a fantastic conversation. And Steve and I appreciate the reference to a 10th annual US-Mexico Security Forum, which we will look forward to a year from now, hopefully in person. And while I would like to hope that a year from now, security wouldn't be such a pressing issue between our two countries, I suspect, based on what we've heard this morning, that it will indeed, in episode 10, we will again want to say that it is a critical issue. But again, thanks to everybody for participating, all of the panelists and the large number of participants who stayed with us this morning. And just a reminder that the second half of our conference will take place a week from today, Tuesday, February 2nd, where we will cover issues including the economic implications of some of these challenges, as well as the future of US-Mexico security cooperation under the Biden and AMLO administration. So I hope you'll join us then a week from now. And with that, I'll thank everybody and hope you have a great day. Thanks.